In the 1870s, doctors across America started prescribing the exact same thing to their sickest patients: go west and breathe. Tuberculosis had no cure, but thin, dry mountain air seemed to slow it down. That single medical theory sent tens of thousands of dying people looking for the one place that could offer it. Whole families packed up entire lives back east on nothing more than a doctor's hopeful guess. Most of the country was too far, too crowded, or too low in elevation to qualify. But at the base of a 14,000-foot mountain in Colorado, a narrow canyon held something almost nobody else had: air that thin, water that fizzed on its own straight out of the ground, and a railroad willing to build a spur line directly to it. Within 20 years, that canyon held 7 grand hotels and a reputation as the Saratoga Springs of the West. That's the thing about Manitou Springs that makes it unlike almost any other resort town in the American West. It was never built on gold, cattle, or timber, the things that built most of Colorado. It was built entirely on a medical theory nobody could actually prove, sold to people who had nothing left to lose. Every boom this canyon ever had came from outsiders chasing a cure. Every bust came when medicine finally figured out the cure wasn't real. Chapter 1: A Railroad Man and a British Doctor. Long before any hotel stood here, this canyon already had a name and a meaning. Ute and Plains tribes, including the Cheyenne and Arapaho, had known these springs for generations before any settler arrived. The water bubbled and popped on its own, carbonated naturally by the limestone it pushed through. The tribes believed that fizzing sound was the breath of the Great Spirit. They left beads and small offerings at the springs as a sign of gratitude. Nobody claimed to own the water. It simply belonged to the canyon. The Ute wintered in the area regularly. They were drawn by the same soothing effects on sour stomachs and dry skin that would later draw thousands of settlers here too, though for very different reasons and with very different intentions toward the land itself. That changed in 1871. A Civil War general named William Jackson Palmer had just founded a new city a few miles east, one he called Colorado Springs. Palmer had made his own fortune in railroads. He understood better than most how a rail line could turn empty land into real value almost overnight. Palmer partnered with a British physician named William Bell. Together, they turned their attention to the springs sitting just west of Palmer's new city, tucked into a narrow forested canyon at the base of Pikes Peak. Palmer and Bell didn't just want a town. They wanted a European-style spa resort, something that could compete with the fashionable mineral resorts of Germany and England. They saw in this canyon exactly what Victorian society prized most: natural beauty, water that seemed to carry genuine therapeutic value, a dramatic mountain backdrop unlike almost anywhere else in the country. They hired a Chicago landscape architect named John Blair to lay out the streets. Blair made an unusual choice. Instead of the rigid grid most American towns used, he let the roads follow the canyon's natural curves. The town would wind the way the water did. That aesthetic decision still shapes how Manitou Springs feels to walk through today. More European village than American frontier settlement. Visitors expecting the familiar checkerboard pattern of most Western towns instead found narrow, curving streets that seemed to have grown organically out of the landscape itself. Before any of this, the site had served a much more practical purpose: a stagecoach stop, feeding travelers heading further into the mountains toward the gold camps around Leadville. When those gold strikes started drying up, the little settlement here struggled to find guests at all. Its future was genuinely uncertain in these earliest years. The Panic of 1873 made things worse. It slowed construction and investment across the entire region for years, threatening to strangle Palmer and Bell's spa town dream before it had even properly begun. The town's first hotel, the Manitou House, opened in 1872 anyway, alongside a simple wooden pavilion built near one of the springs. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a modest wager, on an idea that had not yet been proven out anywhere in the American West. For nearly a decade after, growth stayed slow and uncertain, dependent on whichever travelers happened to pass through. It was a fragile little settlement betting everything on a vision nobody had proven out yet. Everything changed in 1881 when a railroad spur finally connected Manitou directly to Colorado Springs. Suddenly, this quiet canyon wasn't hard to reach anymore. It was a short, easy trip from a real rail line, connected to the broader national network that could deliver visitors from Chicago, New York, and every point in between. That single piece of infrastructure is the actual hinge this entire story turns on. Before it, Manitou was a struggling stagecoach stop with a nice view. After it, Manitou became something else entirely. Word of the springs began spreading fast once that rail connection existed. Newspapers and medical journals across the country started mentioning the Colorado spa town by name. The trickle of visitors that had defined the town's first decade became, within just a few years, a genuine flood. Chapter 2. 7 Grand Hotels. Once the railroad arrived, growth in Manitou Springs happened fast. By the 1890s, the town could boast of 7 grand hotels. The Cliff House, the Barker House, the Grand View. Several of these buildings still stand today, more than a century later. Their Victorian facades are a genuine physical record of just how much money and ambition poured into this narrow canyon during these boom years. Alongside the hotels came smaller boarding houses and summer rental cottages. They were built to handle the thousands of visitors arriving each season, since the grand hotels alone could never have housed everyone who wanted to come. The springs themselves became the town's real product, each one developed, named, and marketed individually, almost like competing brands within the same small downtown. Navajo Springs sat beneath what's now a popcorn and candy shop. Its water once fed a large bathhouse and a bottling plant. That plant shipped Manitou water across the entire country, a genuinely successful national brand built entirely on carbonated water from one small Colorado canyon. Shoshone Spring, tinged faintly with sulfur, was recommended by physicians for its supposed curative properties. It was prescribed the way a modern doctor might prescribe a specific medication. 7 Minute Spring, drilled in 1909, carbonated so heavily that it actually erupted at regular 7-minute intervals. It was a genuine natural spectacle, and visitors would gather to watch, timing their visits specifically to catch the eruption. Twin Spring merged 2 separate drilled sources into one flow. It was prized for its sweeter taste and its calcium and potassium content. Details visitors traded like tasting notes at a modern wine bar. Wheeler Spring, donated to the town by a wealthy local family with banking and railroad interests, rounded out the collection. A genuine walking tour could be built around the springs alone. A large bathhouse became one of the town's central attractions. It offered visitors a proper plunge, since most hotel rooms in this era had no private bathroom of their own. Guests could taste the mineral waters directly at the springs. They could take in the cog railway climbing Pikes Peak. Or they could visit nearby natural wonders like Garden of the Gods and Cave of the Winds, both within easy reach of downtown. A full day here could easily fill itself without a visitor ever needing to leave the immediate area. Locals sometimes joked that a determined tourist could spend an entire week in Manitou and never see the same attraction twice. Given everything the small canyon actually offered, that claim wasn't much of an exaggeration at all. This was Manitou Springs at the height of its first great boom. A genuine spa town, built almost entirely around water that bubbled up out of the ground on its own. It drew visitors from across the entire country who believed, with real conviction, that this specific canyon could heal them. Newspapers as far away as New York and Chicago carried advertisements for Manitou water. The town's name became genuinely recognizable to Americans who had never set foot anywhere near Colorado. Local entrepreneurs kept expanding what the town offered. New bathhouses opened alongside the older ones. Bottling operations grew larger, shipping crates of Manitou water by rail to cities that had never seen a mountain in person. A visitor arriving downtown for the first time in the 1890s would have found a town that felt genuinely prosperous. Its streets were lined with hotels and shops, the constant, quiet sound of carbonated water pushing up through the ground beneath their feet. Horse-drawn carriages ferried guests between hotels and springs throughout the day. It was a small but constant flow of traffic that gave the whole downtown a lively, bustling energy visitors rarely expected from a town this small. Chapter 3: The Cliff House. If one building captures the entire arc of Manitou Springs, it's the Cliff House. It started small in 1873 as a modest 20-room boarding house called, simply, the Inn. It was built to serve stagecoach travelers passing through on their way to the mining country further west. When the gold rush faded, so did the guests. By 1876, the inn was struggling badly to fill its rooms, sitting nearly empty in a canyon that hadn't yet found its real purpose. Its fortunes changed with one man, Edward E. Nichols. Nichols had come west in the 1870s specifically to fight his own case of tuberculosis. He was one of the thousands of patients drawn here by exactly the medical theory this whole story opened with, arriving weak and uncertain of his own future. He beat the illness. Rather than return east, he stayed in Manitou Springs permanently, convinced the canyon's air and water had genuinely saved his life. In 1886, he bought the inn outright and renamed it the Cliff House. His philosophy was simple and direct. Forget the miners and build something for wealthy travelers chasing the springs instead. Nichols expanded the building dramatically, from 20 rooms to the 4.5-story structure that still stands today. He built a proper bathhouse. He threw concerts and formal dinners. He hired bellmen specifically to deliver fresh glasses of sparkling mineral water, straight from Soda Spring, to guests' rooms, turning a simple amenity into a genuine luxury experience nobody else in the region could match. In 1914, he partnered with a man who would later become Colorado's governor, Oliver Shoup, forming the Manitou Bathhouse Company. That business helped spread word of the spring's supposed healing properties even further, reaching an ever wider circle of wealthy, health-conscious travelers. The guest list the Cliff House drew in over the following decades reads like a genuine cross-section of American fame. Theodore Roosevelt stayed there multiple times, developing a real friendship with Nichols along the way. The two men reportedly enjoyed outdoor excursions together during Roosevelt's visits. Clark Gable stayed in a suite that still carries his name today. Thomas Edison stayed there. So did P.T. Barnum and F.W. Woolworth, the retail magnate behind Woolworth's department stores. It was, for a stretch of decades, genuinely one of the most fashionable addresses in the entire American West. You weren't considered properly well-traveled unless you'd stayed there at least once. Oil tycoons, actresses, and East Coast industrialists all found their way to the same dining room, drawn by word of mouth, as much as by any formal advertising campaign. Nichols himself became a genuine local institution. He eventually served as Manitou's mayor for 8 separate terms, a former tuberculosis patient who ended up shaping the entire town's civic life for decades. It's a remarkable arc. A man who arrived here dying and left as the person most responsible for turning the whole town into a national destination. His fellow residents trusted him precisely because his own story mirrored the promise the whole town was making to every new arrival. Come here sick, and there's a real chance you leave healthy, prosperous, and permanently attached to this canyon. But the Cliff House's story wasn't only triumph. In 1921, a flash flood tore through the property, washing out its grill and destroying its entire collection of hymn books. It was a serious blow, but a recoverable one. It was the kind of disaster a wealthy, well-established hotel could absorb and rebuild from within a season or two. A far more serious blow was still decades away, one that would test whether this building and this town could survive at all. Nichols himself would not live to see that later crisis. He spent his final years as one of the town's most respected citizens. He was remembered as much for his civic leadership as for the hotel he'd built. The Cliff House he left behind carried his legacy forward through new owners and new generations, a physical monument to one man's decision to stay in a place that had, quite literally, saved his life. Chapter 4: What Everyone Actually Came For. A trip to Manitou Springs, at its peak, was never just about drinking mineral water. It was a full, multi-day experience, built around a whole cluster of attractions packed into one narrow canyon. The Manitou and Pikes Peak cog railway carried visitors up the mountain itself. It's still today the highest cog railway anywhere in the world. It offered views most visitors had never experienced from any train car before. The train climbed through changing bands of forest until the trees finally gave way entirely to bare alpine rock near the summit. Just outside town, Garden of the Gods presented towering red rock formations that seemed to belong on another planet entirely. It was a free, open landscape that required no ticket and no explanation to appreciate. Its sandstone spires glowed orange and red against the mountain backdrop at sunset. Cave of the Winds offered guided tours through genuine underground passages, cool and dramatic against Colorado's summer heat. It was a welcome escape for visitors who'd spent the morning in the thin, dry air the whole town was famous for. Miramont Castle added its own strange flourish to the town's identity. Built by a French priest named Jean-Baptiste Francolin, it combined 9 different architectural styles into a single, genuinely bizarre structure. Part Romanesque, part Tudor, part something nobody could quite name. It looked like nothing else for 100 miles in any direction. Francolin reportedly built the home for his own comfort and his mother's health. He drew on architectural traditions he'd encountered during a European upbringing far removed from the Colorado frontier. Rainbow Falls gave visitors a shorter, easier hike with a genuine payoff at the end. A waterfall tumbling down smooth granite just a short walk from downtown. It became popular enough with visitors that its rocks eventually had to be closed off from climbers entirely for their own safety. And running through all of it, the springs themselves remained the connective tissue of the whole experience. Visitors moved from spring to spring across the compact downtown, sampling different mineral profiles, each one supposedly suited to a different ailment: sour stomachs, dry skin, general fatigue. Whatever a guest's complaint happened to be, there was a specific Manitou spring recommended to treat it according to the era's popular wisdom. Guests carried small cups or glasses specifically for this purpose. They moved from font to font the way a modern tourist might move between food stalls at a market, sampling as they went. They compared notes with fellow guests on which springs seemed to actually help and which was mostly for show. This was the real Manitou Springs experience, not a hospital town and not merely a scenic stop. It was a genuinely complete resort destination, offering natural wonders, architectural curiosities, and mineral water all within a single, walkable mile of canyon. Families could spend a full week here without ever running out of things to see, do, or drink. That's exactly what made the town's later collapse feel so unlikely to anyone who'd actually visited during these peak decades. Local guidebooks from the era described Manitou almost as its own self-contained world. A visitor could arrive by train, settle into a hotel, and genuinely never need to leave the immediate area for the length of an entire vacation. Photographers set up shop specifically to sell postcards of the springs, the castle, and the canyon. Visitors were eager to prove to friends back home that everything they'd heard about this strange little town was true. Chapter 5. The Medicine Changes Its Mind. The entire foundation Manitou Springs had been built on was, from the very beginning, more belief than proven science. 19th century medicine had few real tools against tuberculosis. Doctors genuinely believed that dry, thin mountain air could slow the disease's progression. Some patients, breathing cleaner air and resting properly for the first time in years, did seem to improve. Whether the air itself deserved the credit, or whether rest and better nutrition simply helped on their own, was never fully settled science. It was, for decades, good enough to build an entire regional economy around. That was true not just in Manitou Springs, but across much of the American West. Wherever elevation and dry air happened to coincide with a railroad willing to build a station nearby. Patients arrived here in genuinely desperate condition, often having exhausted every other treatment available to them back home. Some, like Nichols himself, genuinely recovered and stayed permanently, becoming some of the town's most devoted boosters. Others weren't so fortunate. Manitou Springs, like every other tuberculosis destination of its era, quietly absorbed its share of patients who came chasing a cure and never found one. That reality rarely made it into the postcards and advertisements the town sent out to attract new visitors. But it was a real, constant undercurrent beneath all the resort glamour. Local cemeteries from this era carry the names of visitors who arrived hoping the mountain air would save them. Instead, they found only a final resting place, far from the homes and families they'd left behind. That foundation grew shakier as the 20th century wore on. Medical understanding of tuberculosis advanced considerably. The climate cure theory that had drawn so many patients west lost credibility among serious physicians. Germ theory reshaped how doctors understood the disease entirely, shifting focus away from environmental factors like elevation and dry air toward the actual bacterial cause. It wouldn't be until the 1940s that an actual effective treatment finally arrived, the antibiotic streptomycin. It gave doctors something real to offer tuberculosis patients, something no mountain canyon could compete with, no matter how thin or dry its air happened to be. This shift didn't hit Manitou Springs as a single dramatic event. It arrived quietly, alongside several other pressures the town was facing at the exact same time, each one chipping away at the same foundation from a slightly different angle. A town built on a promise that gradually stopped sounding credible couldn't simply keep marketing that same promise forever. The slow erosion of medical confidence in the climate cure removed one of the central pillars this entire resort economy had originally been built on. There was nothing left to replace it with. Not yet. By the time streptomycin finally arrived in the 1940s, offering real, proven treatment, Manitou Springs had already spent a generation watching its core premise slowly lose credibility. The very doctors who had once sent patients here by the thousands no longer believed in the cure. The town didn't collapse the moment the cure was proven false. It simply lost, gradually, the single strongest reason anyone had ever had to make the trip in the first place. Chapter 6. The Automobile Problem. If the fading medical reputation was one quiet pressure on Manitou Springs, the automobile was a far louder one. It arrived with a speed the town's Victorian-era business model was never designed to absorb. For decades, the entire resort model here had been built around the railroad. Visitors arrived by train, planning to stay for weeks at a time, settling into a grand hotel for an extended, restorative visit. The automobile broke that model apart almost entirely. Visitors could now drive themselves, on their own schedule, staying for a few days instead of several weeks. Manitou became one stop among several, rather than a singular destination worth a month of their summer. That shift changed what visitors actually wanted from the town. Long, formal stays in elaborate Victorian hotels made less sense for a family passing through for a weekend. Cheaper, simpler lodging, built specifically for overnight car travelers, made far more sense instead. Across Colorado and across the entire country, grand old resort hotels increasingly gave way to a new kind of lodging, the Auto Court Motel. These were small individual cabins arranged around a shared parking area, built for convenience rather than grandeur. Guests wanted a clean bed and easy parking, not a formal dining room and a bellman delivering mineral water to their suite. The entire economics of hospitality had shifted underneath towns like Manitou almost overnight. Few of the grand old hotels were built with the flexibility to adapt. Manitou Springs followed the same pattern. The elaborate hotel culture that had defined the town for decades started losing ground to something far more modest. Several of the smaller boarding houses and cottages that had once supplemented the grand hotels simply couldn't compete with cheap, purpose-built motor courts springing up along the new automobile routes. The mineral springs themselves, once the entire reason anyone came here at all, started slipping out of fashion as water cures fell further and further out of medical favor. Neglect set in gradually. Some springs were capped entirely, sealed off and forgotten beneath sidewalks and parking lots. Others were simply diverted or built over as the town's attention drifted elsewhere toward whatever business seemed likely to survive the changing tastes of a new generation of travelers. Business owners who had spent decades catering to long-staying, health-conscious guests found themselves scrambling to reinvent their offerings. Their new customers wanted speed and convenience, not a lingering, restorative escape. Not everyone made that transition successfully. Empty storefronts began appearing on streets that had once been fully occupied. Some hotel owners tried converting their grand old buildings into cheaper boarding arrangements, hoping to catch at least some of the new automobile traffic passing through. The results were often mixed and frequently disappointing. Chapter 7. A long, quiet decline. By the middle of the 20th century, Manitou Springs had settled into a genuine, sustained stagnation. The grand Victorian buildings that had once represented the height of American resort architecture were aging badly. Many fell into real disrepair. Paint peeled, ornate wooden trim rotted in place, unrepaired for want of money or attention. The town's economy had depended for decades on a steady stream of health-seeking visitors. It struggled without that reliable foundation underneath it. This wasn't a sudden collapse the way some places in the series experienced. It was a slow, grinding erosion, stretched out across generations. It's the kind of decline that's hard to point to a single year and call the beginning of. The Cliff House itself became a direct symbol of this broader decline. In 1982, a fire tore through the historic building. It sat vacant for the following 16 years. Its Victorian grandeur slowly deteriorated. Its rooms sat empty. Its once famous guest list reduced to a memory nobody was actively preserving. Weeds grew up around a building that had once hosted the President of the United States. Windows broke and stayed broken. Local kids reportedly dared each other to sneak inside, treating a hotel that had once hosted presidents and movie stars as nothing more than a spooky, half-forgotten ruin at the edge of town. A hotel that had once hosted a sitting president and one of Hollywood's biggest stars stood dark for nearly 2 decades. It was a genuine, physical monument to how far the entire town had fallen from its own golden age. Manitou Springs during these years wasn't gone. It was simply forgotten, a place people drove past on their way somewhere else. Its Victorian storefront sat increasingly empty. Its once famous springs were reduced to curiosities nobody thought to maintain. Longtime residents watched buildings they remembered from childhood sit empty for years at a stretch. Nobody was certain whether the town's best days were simply behind it for good. Property values sagged. Younger residents left for opportunities elsewhere. It was the same slow bleed that hit so many small American towns during these same decades, regardless of what industry had originally built them. There was no single dramatic headline announcing Manitou's decline the way there had been for some of the other towns in the series. No riot, no bankruptcy filing, no factory closing on a specific datable morning. Just a long, quiet drift, decade after decade, as the specific reasons people had once traveled here from across the country gradually stopped applying to anyone. Even longtime residents struggled to point to a single year and say that's when things really started going wrong. Nothing about the decline had ever arrived that cleanly. Chapter 8. Keep Manitou Weird. The turnaround, when it finally came, wasn't driven by any single dramatic event. It was driven by patient, deliberate preservation work. In 1983, Manitou Springs earned formal recognition as a National Historic District, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That designation mattered enormously. It gave the town's remaining Victorian architecture legal protection. Just as importantly, it gave preservation-minded residents and investors a genuine reason to start restoring rather than demolishing what remained. Grants and tax incentives tied to historic preservation status made restoration financially viable in a way it simply hadn't been for decades. Building owners who had spent years watching their properties slowly deteriorate finally had a real financial reason to invest in fixing them instead of letting them continue to decay. An arts colony began growing in the town's newly protected, increasingly picturesque setting. It was drawn by cheap real estate and genuine Victorian charm. Most other Colorado towns had already lost teardowns and modernization. Painters, sculptors, and craftspeople moved into buildings that had sat neglected for years, filling storefronts that had been dark since the mid-century decline. Some of these early arrivals later described the town during this transitional period as feeling almost like a ghost town with good bones. It was empty but full of obvious potential, waiting for someone to finally see it. In 1987, a group of dedicated locals formed the Mineral Springs Foundation. It was built specifically to rediscover, restore, and protect the town's original springs, many of which had been capped, ignored, or forgotten for decades by this point. The foundation eventually took stewardship of 8 of the town's public springs. It worked to construct and maintain small fountains, or fonts, at each one. That gave visitors an actual reason to seek the water out again, rather than walking straight past a manhole cover with no idea what lay beneath it. Volunteers spent years tracking down old survey maps and city records just to locate springs that had been paved over decades earlier. At times, they weren't even certain whether the water still flowed beneath the concrete. The Cliff House's own restoration became the clearest single symbol of the entire town's turnaround. It had stood empty for 16 years following the 1982 fire. After formal listing on the National Register of Historic Places, the hotel underwent a $10.5 million restoration. It reopened in 1999, its Victorian grandeur genuinely restored rather than merely patched over. Its dining room and guest suites were rebuilt to the exacting standard the building's original reputation demanded. The same building that had once hosted Theodore Roosevelt and Clark Gable was, once again, welcoming guests. Its 5-story silhouette was once again the first thing visitors noticed arriving in town. Out of this whole revival period, Manitou Springs developed a new identity, distinct from its original health resort branding. Locals started describing their own town with a simple, proud motto: keep Manitou weird. It wasn't trying to be Saratoga Springs anymore. It wasn't selling a cure for tuberculosis anymore either, since nobody believed in that cure any longer. It was becoming something else entirely. A genuinely creative, slightly eccentric mountain town that wore its Victorian bones alongside a modern, artistic, unmistakably independent streak. It drew visitors for reasons that had nothing to do with the original medical premise. This whole canyon had been built around a century earlier. Local businesses leaned into this new identity deliberately. Independent shops, galleries, and restaurants replaced the bathhouses and bottling plants that had once defined the same storefronts. The town's annual events calendar grew to include genuinely strange, locally beloved traditions. These celebrations had nothing to do with mineral water, and everything to do with the offbeat, artistic character the town had grown into over the preceding 2 decades. Chapter 9. Manitou Springs Today. Today, Manitou Springs draws visitors in numbers that would likely surprise anyone who only knew the town during its mid-century low point. The springs themselves, thanks largely to the Mineral Springs Foundation's ongoing work, are once again a genuine part of the visitor experience. A dedicated walking map now guides visitors from font to font across downtown, sampling water at Wheeler Spring, Twin Spring, Stratton Spring, and others. It's the same basic activity 19th century health seekers once traveled across the entire country to do. The water is free. Bring your own bottle, and you can fill it straight from the same limestone aquifer the Ute and Plains tribes once considered sacred. No ticket required. No bathhouse attendant standing between you and the source. The Cliff House operates today as a genuine luxury hotel again. Its restaurant is regularly praised. Its Victorian architecture is fully restored, functioning as both a working business and a living piece of the town's own history. Guests today book rooms named for the same famous visitors who once actually stayed in them, the Clark Gable suite among the most requested. Wedding parties and anniversary trips now fill the same dining room where Theodore Roosevelt once ate. Most guests are only vaguely aware of just how close the building once came to being lost for good. Miramont Castle still stands, still strange, still drawing curious visitors who wander through its 9 mismatched architectural styles without quite knowing what to expect around the next corner. The cog railway still climbs Pikes Peak, carrying a new generation of tourists up the exact same route it always has. Garden of the Gods and Cave of the Winds remain unchanged, exactly the natural spectacles they always were. They are indifferent to whatever has happened in the town below them. This is a town that never fully recovered its original reason for existing. Nobody comes to Manitou Springs today genuinely believing its water will cure tuberculosis. That specific belief, the one this entire town was built around, has been settled medical history for the better part of a century now. And yet the town itself didn't disappear when that belief did. It simply found new reasons to matter, new visitors chasing something other than a cure. History, art, strange architecture, and water that still tastes exactly the way it always has, whatever it can or can't actually heal. The town's tourism board today rarely mentions the word cure at all. It focuses instead on hiking, art walks, and the sheer novelty of a place unlike anywhere else in Colorado. Modern visitor surveys consistently rank the town's walkability, its historic character, and its offbeat, artistic personality among the top reasons people choose to visit. Those reasons would have made almost no sense to the Victorian tourists who first filled these same streets a century and a half ago. Downtown Manitou today mixes eras in a way that feels genuinely unforced. A Victorian storefront might house a modern coffee shop. A 100-year-old bathhouse building might now hold an art gallery. The town's original architecture never disappeared. It simply found new tenants, new purposes, new reasons for existing that its Victorian builders could never have anticipated. Visitors walking Manitou Avenue today are, in a very real sense, walking through a town that's already reinvented itself once, successfully. It shows every sign of being willing to do it again. Street performers, small galleries, and independent bookshops now occupy the same block where a bottling plant once shipped mineral water across the country. So that's the story of Manitou Springs. Now I want to hear from you. Did you know it started as a healing town for the sick and dying? Did you visit during the Grand Hotel era? Have you had dinner at the Cliff House before or after the fire? Have you tasted the water straight from one of the springs downtown? Maybe you knew Manitou only as it is today. The arts, the weird little shops, the mountain backdrop, with no idea what the town was actually built to cure. Tell us your Manitou Springs story in the comments below. And if this story showed you how a town survives losing the entire reason it was built, hit that like button and subscribe. We cover the places that keep finding a reason to matter long after the first one stopped working.